so because we're talking about a lot of people, and those people will be mentioned. So if you don't have them, if you'll raise your hand, somebody will bring them to you. We have a whole pile of them over here on the table. All right, and what I'm going to be discussing today, and again in the back, can you all hear? Okay. All right, what I'm going to be discussing today is one of the most well-known of the struggles for the vote, and it's the struggle for women's suffrage. And many people who are familiar with the movements in Britain and the United States are aware of some of the connections. And what I do is I contend that there was an extensive interaction between the two movements, and it was on a much broader scale than is generally known about how the British and the American women were working together. And it begins in the late 1800s and it continues to 1914. And today I'm going to be discussing some of the connections between the British and the American suffrage movements. And before I begin, I would like to point out the use of the terms woman suffrage and women's suffrage. And in the United States, the 19th century discussion of the economic, social, and political rights of women was called the woman question. And the movement for political enfranchisement was called, in the United States, they called it the woman suffrage movement. And to our ears today, to a lot of people, that sounds ungrammatical, it sounds awkward. And the British movement used the term women's suffrage to describe the campaign for the vote, while the International Suffrage Organization used the term woman suffrage. And when I was studying in Britain, well, a lot of times I talk about woman suffrage, and of course the Brits used women's suffrage, so it was like you were using, words that were not grammatically put together and all of that. So again, but the Americans used woman suffrage, the Brits women's suffrage. And the event that's usually regarded as the beginning of the women's rights movement in the United States, the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848 that many of you are familiar with, that had British origins. And the two best known participants of the Seneca Falls meeting, Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, first met at the World's Anti-Slavery Convention held in London in June of 1840. And Lucretia Mott was a delegate. And the presence of having the women delegates there set off this heated debate, and the majority of the members decided against the women, and they refused to let them be a delegate to the meeting. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton was in London on her honeymoon, and her new husband, Henry Stanton, was one of the most capable speakers for the American abolitionist movement. And Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton stayed in the same London lodging house. They became acquainted, and they resolved that as soon as they returned home, they would form a society to advocate the rights of women. And after the convention, the Stantons remained in Britain. Henry Stanton was in great demand as an anti-slavery speaker, and through him, Elizabeth Cady Stanton met some of the leading Quaker families and reformers in Britain. And the link between Elizabeth Cady Stanton and later her daughter and the British reformers of the late 19th century constitutes an important part of the early interaction between the American and the British suffragists. So early on, you had people like that getting together to work. Then time goes by, and 8 years passed before Mott and Stanton acted on their London resolution to hold a convention. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton was young, and so the young Elizabeth Cady Stanton settles into the role of wife, homemaker, and mother, and eventually she has 7 children. So that's that time in her life when that's happening. And eventually what happens in 1848, the meeting they talked about took place. And at the Seneca Falls Convention, Elizabeth Cady Stanton was responsible for the inclusion of the first official demand for the franchise for women in the Declaration of Sentiments. So in the document that they put together at that meeting, it does ask for, the women for the franchise for women. And although there was some opposition to putting that in the resolution, it remains in the document. And Stanton first met Susan B. Anthony at an anti-slavery convention in Seneca Falls in May of 1851. And as many of you know, they were friends and comrades for a long time, and so the two women at that time began their 50-year working partnership. Because when you do the women's suffrage movement in the United States, you always think about Anthony and Stanton. By 1869, there were 2 woman suffrage organizations in the United States. The National American Woman Suffrage Association, headed by Stanton and Anthony, and the American Woman Suffrage Association with Lucy Stone at the head of its executive committee. And then in 1890, the 2 organizations merged, and it became the organization that many of you all know, the National American Woman Suffrage Association. All right, in Britain, the Manchester Women's Suffragist Committee was formed in 1867, and then other suffrage groups were organized shortly afterwards in London, in Edinburgh, in Bristol, and in Birmingham. And many women, including Lydia Becker and Millicent Fawcett, were active in the suffrage movement during the next decades, and they were members of these new committees. By the 1870s, suffrage newspapers were established in both countries. The suffrage papers were links between the two movements, and the suffrage papers discussed the problems, the strategies, the progress of the suffrage movement in both countries. And the word sisters was often used to describe those who were across the Atlantic. My sister in Britain, my sister in the United States. And suffrage leader in each country became household names because there was a lot of coverage in newspapers and in articles about them. And when the suffragists later met these leaders, they had a sense of knowing who they were, and they had a sense of knowing what they were like and their personalities. And letters to the editor and articles from suffragists in the other country were regular features, and during the entire suffrage campaign, suffragists linked the two movements together by declaring that success in one country would stimulate success in the other country. Women used the situation in the other country to bolster their own movement. American suffragists applauded the municipal vote that the British got. The British suffragists praised the western states of the United States as well as Australia and New Zealand for giving women the vote. During the 1880s, the interaction between the British and American suffrage movements escalated, and a major factor was the excessive amount of time that Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony spent in Britain. I'm not sure that a lot of people are aware of how much time they spent in Britain and how much they worked with the British suffragists and so on. Now, and Stanton is especially interesting because of her relationship there with her daughter. Stanton spent the winter of 1882-1883 in Britain, so she spends the whole winter. Her daughter, Harriet Eaton Stanton, had married an Englishman, William Henry Blatch, in November of 1832. And because the couple made their home in Basingstoke, England, well, Stanton, the mother, spends months with her daughter, and consequently, Stanton has ties to many of the British suffragists, and also it's a permanent base where she can operate out and maintain contact with the reformers and the suffrage leaders. And during the first winter, she met people all over the country. She met Lydia Becker, with whom she'd often corresponded. Stanton spoke to British audiences. In Scotland, she spoke in Glasgow, and then she went to Edinburgh, where she visited some of her old friends. Some were some people that she had met in London when she had been there in 1840, and they discussed all together the status of women on both sides of the Atlantic. So what you're seeing would be, in both countries, people are getting to know each other and what's happening there. Harriet Stanton Blatch, the daughter of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, became a very important suffrage figure in the next generation. And she later observed, and this is an interesting comment, she says, "Through my mother, I became intimately acquainted with her old friends of 1840 and their descendants." She said, "The women of England were just then organizing political clubs, and I was invited to speak before them." So you have a mother-daughter, relationship going on, and again, the whole thing that the daughter is in Britain now. In February of 1883, Susan B. Anthony sailed for Britain, and through Stanton, Anthony met a lot of the British suffragists. And Stanton and Anthony were honored at receptions, and they made speeches that were quoted in the suffrage newspapers. And then Anthony went to Scotland and went to Ireland, and she was entertained by the suffragists there. And then Stanton and Anthony went back to the United States in November of 1883. And a note from Millicent Fawcett demonstrates the expanding links between the suffragists and their two countries. And this is what Fawcett wrote. She said, "I'm so very glad that you and Mrs. Stanton have been to England, and now you know nearly almost all of our active workers." So you're getting a network between the two countries now, and of course Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton are two of the figures that we know most. In October of 1886, Stanton again left for Britain. And during the winter of 1886-87, she received a number of visitors and old friends, and she continued to give speeches. And she made her last visit in 1890-1891. And Stanton was also meeting some of the younger suffragists. And here's one that you'll find interesting. In July of 1891, Ursula Bright and Emmeline Pankhurst came to Basingstoke, where she lived, where again Stanton lived, and where again her daughter lived, and they came there for the day. So you're meeting the younger generation that you're coming. Okay. And by the time you get to the mid-1880s, Harriet Stanton Blatch was increasingly becoming involved with the British suffrage movement. She was giving speeches, she was writing articles, and Blatch and Emmeline Pankhurst, later, who were major figures, as we all know, in the suffrage movement, worked together. They knowing each other now in this younger period. And both Blatch and Pankhurst were members of the Women's Franchise League. And not only were Harriet Stanton Blatch and Emmeline Pankhurst acquainted, their children, Christabel and Sylvia Pankhurst and Nora Blatch, also knew each other. And this fact becomes significant because these are children who had known and played with each other. And then, of course, later on in the second generation, they will have major roles in the suffrage movement. And Christabel and Sylvia Pankhurst later described Blatch and her mother. And Christabel wrote, "Mrs. Katie Stanton, the woman suffrage pioneer from America, was a speaker who greatly interested us." And Christabel described Blatch as a friend. Sylvia found Blatch outspoken and said, "I thought Mrs. Blatch immensely learned and stood in great awe of her." In 1892, Anthony became president of the National Association and Anna Howard Shaw became vice president. And Shaw accompanied Anthony on her second trip across the Atlantic in 1899, where Anthony presided at the International Council of Women meeting in London. Anthony was honored at many receptions, dinners, and gatherings. She saw many of her old friends. She renewed the acquaintances, and she remained in Britain for a month, and she visited many friends. The American suffragist Millicent Garrett Fawcett, who had begun suffrage work in the 1870s when she was a young woman in her 20s. Her husband, Henry Fawcett, was a Cambridge professor who had been accidentally blinded as a young man. He won a seat in Parliament in 1865 and became Postmaster General in 1880. His unexpected death in 1884 was a blow to the suffrage movement because he had been one of the major parliamentary champions for women's suffrage. A lot of people in Parliament obviously were not for women's suffrage, and here again you had Henry Fawcett being someone who was advocating that. By 1880, Millicent Fawcett was becoming increasingly involved in suffrage work. Americans continued to invite her to participate in the suffrage organizations. And in 1897, and this one is one that people will remember, in 1897, the organization with which Millicent Fawcett would be primarily identified, the National Union of Women Suffrage Societies, became a federation. And although the member societies were basically autonomous in the early movement, by 1903, the NUWSS had a lot of control over the member societies. So that's going to be a major suffrage societies on the British side, the National Union of Women Suffrage Societies, and you're going to be seeing, as we go along, how that's different from the other well-known organizations. So therefore, by the time you get to the end of the 19th century, two of the major suffrage organizations are in place. The National American Woman Suffrage Association, headed by Susan B. Anthony, and the National Union of Women Suffrage Societies, headed by Millicent Fawcett. And both of these became the large mainstream suffrage organizations in their countries. In the United States, for the turn of the century, emphasis on a constitutional amendment was declining, and the National Association was focusing on let's win the vote state by state. And in Britain, the situation was different. Women could vote in municipal elections, and they could vote in school board elections. What British women needed was the parliamentary vote. Only Parliament could pass a woman suffrage bill, so the British suffragists had to pass suffrage legislation through Parliament. By the turn of the century, the first generation of suffrage leaders had died or were elderly women. In 1900, Anthony resigned as president of the National American Woman Suffrage Association, and Carrie Chapman Catt took her place. And on the handout that you have with the photographs, you will see photographs of most of these people. You can see again Carrie Chapman Catt. You can see again the two that I talked about, the other ones. But you're going to see more of them now. I didn't have anything of Anthony and Stanton. Okay. Catt served again. Carrie Chapman Catt took place as president of the National Association, and Catt served for about 4 years, and then she resigned because her husband was health, and he died in 1905. And so, but again, Carrie Chapman Catt, and you can probably see her on your photo sheet too, because she's one of the most important people both in the American movement and in the international movement. And again, her greatest asset, she's a very good organizer, she's a very good administrator, and she has very good leadership skills. She's one of the most well-known women in the suffrage movement. When you think about the British knowing her, and international people knowing her, and Americans knowing her. When Elizabeth Cady Stanton died in 1902, she was mourned on both sides of the Atlantic. And her daughter, Harriet Stanton Blatch, lived in Britain for 20 years and worked in the suffrage societies, the Women's Local Government Society, the local branch of the Liberal Federation, and later the Fabian Society that many of you are familiar with. And then Blatch goes back to live in the United States in 1902. And she uses her British experiences and acquaintances to influence the movement in the United States. And Blatch was much less conservative than many members of the National American Woman Suffrage Association, and some of them found her a real problem. And leaders of the national organization had to recognize that Blatch was Elizabeth Cady Stanton's daughter, and that Nora Stanton Blatch was Stanton's granddaughter. However, not all of the new generation of leaders had liked Elizabeth Cady Stanton. I mean, some people just didn't like her. And although many of the younger women adored Susan B. Anthony, they found Stanton radical, and they insisted that sometimes she hurt the cause. And so their dislike of Stanton may have affected their feelings about her daughter, Blatch, who in many ways was just like her mother. And Blatch was critical of what she perceived to be a very stagnant suffrage movement. And so she irritated some of the leaders in the national organization. And contending that the American movement was in a rut, Blatch later organized the Equality League of Self-Supporting Women so that you could use new methods in the American movement. All right, now we get to someone else you know. Okay. In Britain in 1903, Emmeline Pankhurst founded the Women's Social and Political Union in Manchester. That's where she lived. It was in Manchester. She was the widow of Dr. Richard Pankhurst, a lawyer who had died suddenly in 1898. And for the first years, the WSPU was just a local organization that operated like the older suffrage organization societies. They would just give speeches and circulate petitions and so on. In 1904, Anna Howard Shaw became president. And again, all of these people's photographs are on the sheet that you have, okay? In 1904, Anna Howard Shaw became president of the National Association of the United States. And she lacked caste organizational ability. Some people said she was the greatest woman orator of all time. She liked to give speeches, and some of them thought she was very good. Anna Howard Shaw was born in Britain at Newcastle-on-Tyne. Her family immigrated to the United States when she was a child. She was a very interesting background, this person. So they immigrated to the United States as a child, and she grew up in the wilderness of Michigan. She lived out in the wilderness. She became an ordained minister, and she received a medical degree. I mean, this is someone who's going to be a leader in the suffrage movement. She makes her first trip back to Britain in 1878, and she was in Britain frequently during the years of the suffrage movement, where she became very well known, and she participated in many British suffrage activities. She was always in their parades, and she always wore her cap and gown in the parades and so on. So you can have a photograph of her there. So whenever there was a procession, again, Anna Howard Shaw would be in that procession. And Shaw becomes a major figure in the international movement. But you can see her that I'm trying to think if the photograph I gave you, I think it's on the bottom side that you can see what she looks like. All right. So we now already have those organizations, and we're going to add another one, and then we'll kind of work with what we have. Because in 1904, the International Woman Suffrage Alliance officially came into existence in Berlin. So this is an international alliance, not just a British or an American. And Carrie Chapman Catt became president of the International Woman Suffrage Association, with Millicent Fawcett as second vice president. Later on, she'd be first vice president. And both British and American women worked in leadership positions in this international organization. And they would meet in committees, they would correspond, worked on agendas and problems, and they socialized with each other. So you're getting a network of a lot of women who know each other. And of course you have the British and American women, but you're also now including women in some of the other European countries who are involved in the suffrage movement too. And after the Berlin meeting, Anthony visited a lot of her old, after the Berlin meeting, Anthony visited a lot of her old friends, and many of the co-workers, and at a garden party honoring Anthony, brief speeches were made by American and British women, and the people who gave speeches included Anthony and Fawcett and Cat and Shaw. And by the time you get to 1904, Cat and Shaw represented the new generation. So we're getting past now that first generation, and these people are becoming very much, again, acquainted with the major figures in the British movement. And after London, Anthony and Shaw went to Manchester and Edinburgh and Bristol, and they received honors and recognition from people there. So they're going to these meetings, and they're being recognized, and they're being awarded and given things to again show the movement and what they're doing. Now we get to another part, because a lot of you all know this part of the story because you've seen it in films. What is usually considered the first act of militancy on the part of the WSPU occurred in October of 1905 when Christabel Pankhurst and Annie Kenney, who was a working class member of the WSPU, attended a political meeting in Manchester in which Edward Grey of the Liberal Party was giving a speech. It was a political election that year and so on. So these are two young women, they're about 20 years old, the two young women, and they stand up and they shout, "Will the Liberal Party give votes to women?" And the young women were ejected from the meeting, and they told a crowd outside what happened, and the women were arrested on a charge of obstruction of justice, and in Christabel's case, she was charged with assaulting a policeman. And she said something to the policeman. It was classy and so on. So they were summoned to appear in the next morning in a police court. And when they got to the police court, they were told they could either pay a fine or go to jail, and they both chose jail. And so the story's in all of the newspapers now. It's all over, and there's a lot of publicity now given to votes for women. And so during the next years, the WSPU was always involved in what we call mild militancy. Members would stand up and they would interrupt meetings. If you all had someone up here conducting a meeting, well, the suffragettes out there would all start yelling at you, or they would be saying votes for women or something. And they would interrupt meetings. They would be up in the balcony and they would let flags down that would say votes for women. You'd see them out on the street and they would be chalking votes for women on the sidewalks. And they would chain themselves to fences and railings, and someone would have to come and unlock the chains and so on. So all of these activities bring a lot of publicity, but once, as most of you know, once you go on this kind of campaign and you keep just, saying votes for women or riding on the sidewalk, well, after a while, that gets to be old stuff. So you have to think of something new, and it probably has to be a lot more sensational. And that's what you're going to see as we go through the next years. Every time you do something and people get bored, then you have to up it, and you have to have something that's more sensational, which you will be seeing. In 1906, the British newspaper, the Daily Mail, used the word suffragette to distinguish the militant with her newer methods from the more conventional, law-abiding suffragist. And the distinction between the suffragist and suffragette was recognized in both Britain and the United States, though sometimes the United States got the words mixed up. But anyhow, it was so if you were a suffragette, you were someone who would break the law, or could. We'll see the laws are going to start breaking. And then if you were a suffragist, you abided by the law. All right? Then you get to some other changes. In 1906, you have an important year in WSPU history. The WSPU moved its headquarters to London. They moved out of Manchester, they moved to London, and it becomes a national organization. And in addition, and this is her pictures on the flyer I gave you, the Pethick Lawrences became associated with the organization. And Emmeline Pethick Lawrence is a key person to know about this. She became treasurer of the WSPU, and later her husband, Fred Pethick Lawrence, was editor of the WSPU newspaper, Votes for Women. Votes for Women was a good suffrage newspaper, as you see. You can see copies of it when you go to Britain today. I mean, they have lots of copies in the archives and the libraries and so on. And the Pethick Lawrences brought talent, they brought respectability, they were rich, they brought money, and they brought a very influential circle of friends to the WSPU. So now it's not just the Pankhursts, but you have this very, well-to-do couple who are very smart and who are lending themselves to the cause, and they are going to be loyal to the WSPU. So the Patrick Lawrences were instrumental in developing the spectacular side of the suffrage campaign, and they would use, these are the kinds of things that the WSP used. You would be out walking and you'd see a big kite flying across the street, and it would say "Votes for Women." You would see boats, with posters on them saying "Votes for Women." You would have posters, you would have umbrellas, you would have organizational colors, you would have parades that would advertise "Votes for Women," and they all had different colors like football teams, but you would have one having one color, and the WSPU was purple, white, and green. So and even in the department stores as time goes by, you see the purple, white, and green banners. You could go into Selfridges and you could find all this merchandise about the WSPU, and they have the purple, white, and green ribbons, and you can have ribbons of other colors or so on. All right. By 1906, more than WSPU members were being arrested, so there are more of them being arrested, not just those two young women at the beginning. And so they would be arrested because they did something that was not considered to be, what you should do. So they would be taken to the jail. They would then choose to go to prison rather paying a fine. And then when they got out, there would be a well-publicized breakfast. And so they would come out and everybody would cheer them when they came out. They were sort of like heroes, and they look what you did. And so there would be comments on the behavior appearing in the press on both sides of the Atlantic. They would talk about these young suffragettes got out, and so therefore they're doing this or that. And Alice Stone Blackwell, who was editor of the Woman's Journal, who was the leading suffrage newspaper in the United States, was not as harsh about women militants as were some of the British papers. And the Woman's Journal was an interesting journal. It always took a very general attitude. And this is what, again, the Alice Stone Blackwell says. She says, "These methods are not ours. We do not necessarily agree with them, but we understand why the women were pushed to resort to these actions, and it is the fault of the government." So again, this is what she would say. We may not agree, but we understand why they're doing it. In August of 1906, the International Woman Suffrage Association Congress was held in Copenhagen. And a lot of American women were going to Copenhagen, but they stop in London on the way. And so they visit London. They often go to the WSPU because they had receptions every week, and they would meet people there. And Fred Patrick Lawrence said, "American women, in quotation marks, doing London, considered their visit incomplete if they had not been present at one of the WSPU gatherings. So while we're there, let's go to a meeting at the WSPU." At a later IWS conference in London, in Amsterdam, Stockholm, and Budapest, American women followed the same pattern, and they often participated in events and activities of the British Suffrage Association. And Carrie Chapman Catt, in her role as international president, was always honored, and she was praised at receptions and dinners in London on her way to and from a conference. So you're seeing a number of Americans playing different roles, and again, Carrie Chapman Catt is at the head of the international organization. All right, then you get another thing. Many American women participated in the huge suffrage processions, and you will see, I think, on your when you see Anna Howard Shaw and some of those people, they were in parades all the time. There were many, many parades. And so the first large procession of the National Union of Women Suffrage Societies took place in February of 1907. That's the one that Fawcett is in. You can see her on the bottom of one of those pages. And during the next years, the WSPU and the NUWSS sponsored huge parades. Oh, thank you. Okay, I might need it. Can you hear me? Okay, I may need that before it's over. Okay. All right. So what you have, so you're having these huge parades. I mean, these were giant parades, and so they would have huge parades. They would have hundreds of people marching. Some of the photographs that you can see, some of those very same people were marching. You would have bands playing. Women would wear academic gowns, so if you have degrees, you wear those. If you have a certain profession, if you're a physician or a nurse, you wear that outfit. If you wear a trade, if you're from a certain area of Scotland or Britain or wherever, okay, you do that. Or if it's something about history, okay, you can dress up like a person. And so you have all this pageantry, and you have the sheer size of these demonstrations, and a lot of the Americans who went over there were impressed with this, and they go back home. They go to their friends in the clubs and the suffrage meetings. You can see what they're doing in Britain now. And British speakers were finding that the American audiences were interested in what was happening in the British movement, which Catt described in 1908 as the storm center of the movement. And Ethel Snowden is another person. There are books that you can get. And Ethel Snowden was, again, a suffragist who went through the United States, speaking in little towns and big towns. But she would talk about what the suffrage movement was like in Britain. She was the wife of a member of Parliament, Philip Snowden, and she made a number of trips to the United States. The first trip was in 1908. She spoke at the annual meeting of the National Association in Buffalo. So you see, it's not just Chicago and New York you're going to all of these different places. She spoke in many U.S. cities and a lot of colleges, and Snowden was well regarded and received a lot of press coverage. Now this next one is important, as you'll see. In June of 1908, following a WSPU demonstration in Parliament Square, some women were treated roughly by the crowd, and many women were arrested and they were taken to the police station. That's what's happening to women now. They're arrested, taken to the police station. They again stay in prison rather than pay a fine. But on this evening, this is in June of 1908, in this evening, two windows were broken at number 10 Downing Street. You just go over it, you have a hammer, you go like that. Okay. And the window breaking was a spontaneous, independent act on the part of two women. They didn't ask anyone. No one told them to do it. They get these things and they break the glass at number 10 Downing. Okay. The WSPU had no prior knowledge of the stone throwing, and there was no authorization from WSP headquarters. They had not said they could do this. And Millicent Fawcett, who's the leader of the ones who are the law-abiding, she later asserted in 1908 the NUWSS made a definite break with the WSPU. In other words, the law-abiding people are going to take a break from those people who are now breaking the law. Okay, we'll come back. You're going to see later, many of you are familiar with the kind of laws that are going to be broken. And the year 1909 can be regarded as the peak of interaction between the American and British movements. The International Woman Suffrage Association met in London in April of 1909. You have an American president, Carrie Chapman Catt. You have a London Congress. There were a lot of letters written before the people got there. The window breaking received a lot of mention. Did you know they broke windows? And in her letters, to Alice Stone Blackwell and Carrie Millicent Fawcett denounced the actions of the WSPU. Remember, she's law-abiding. And although Fawcett recognized the contributions of the WSPU in the early period of bringing publicity to the cause, Fawcett was determined we are not going to cooperate with them any longer. But within the ranks of the National Union, there were some members who still admired and supported the WSPU. Just because the person at the top says we're not going to deal with them anymore, there were people in the membership who said, yeah, they are getting somewhere, we should do it. All right, so other things now happen. It's escalating here, you'll see. In the months prior to the London Congress, women from suffrage organizations in Britain and the United States planned events, hospitality programs. The meeting started in April of 1906. The Congress was crammed with meetings and speeches and reports and excursions and field trips and receptions. You could go to all those things. And the London meeting, Congress, was considered a great success by both British and American suffragists. This was a whirlwind of activities. The Americans could come, they could see, they could hear, they could become acquainted with a lot of the British suffragists and suffragettes. They could see both of them. And one of the delegates from Seattle said, we have learned lots of things from our English sisters, and when we return, we're going to put into operation some of the methods of the English suffragettes. And she emphasized that American women must hold open-air meetings, they must organize processions, and she was also impressed by the colorful suffrage posters. You could buy these in magazines, in department stores and other stores. You could get things like this at Selfridges. You could do that. They're wonderful.